Hey there, comrades. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. I should also say, bienvenidos, willkommen, merci. I don't know. We got a bunch of new listeners from all over the place. We have new listeners in France, in Germany. I know we have a good number of listeners in Spain now. And we also have some new listeners from Australia. So big shout out to our comrades down there as well. And thanks for joining us. This week, we have a very special first of a two-parter lined up for you. If you caught our episode last week, you heard me mention at the end that what we're going to be doing this week and next is OG Comrade Commissar Don and I are going to be tackling a very personally meaningful and a very favorite book of mine by Enzo Traverso, the Marxist historian, called Left-Wing Melancholia, Marxism, History, and Memory. So just a quick preview of what you can expect out of this episode. We're going to talk a lot about some of the core concepts of Traverso's book. We're going to talk a good bit about our own personal experiences with left-wing melancholia and try to really take the interesting theory and history and analysis that's in Traverso's book and really try to bring it back to our own day-to-day lives, our own experience, and hopefully be able to make some sense out of major questions that we both have had, that we've also tackled on prior episodes. Things about the relationship of leftist politics to history, utopian imaginations of the future, and some of the disconnects and challenges that we find ourselves grappling with whenever we try to understand what an alternative to the state of global capitalism that we find ourselves within could look like. Now, I'm not going to promise any answers, but I guess I will promise at least some interesting questions and identification of particular blocks and barriers to that exact idea. All right, no more spoilers. Y'all are just going to have to listen to the episode. Please remember to subscribe on iTunes. Find us on Patreon if you'd like to support the show monetarily, materially, however you want to think about it. Like us on Facebook. Transcribe whole episodes of the show. Put it into a bottle. Throw it off of your yacht or your ship or your rowboat, whatever it is that you use, and hopefully someone will pick it up along the way and radicalize and start some sort of revolution before it's too late. Okay, I'm really struggling here with some of these ways to get our show out, to propagandize the masses. So maybe send us some comments, leave us some quotes and ideas about how you'd like to do that. All right, without further ado, let's get on with the show. All right, what's up, y'all? Welcome to episode 11 of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. On the show with me today is...
Hello.
Who are you?
I am Don. I guess you can call me Comrade Don.
Yeah,
as is the...
Well, considering you now... You're like my accomplice in this. You now are upgraded to Comrade Commissar Don.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, so that's real shit. You're sitting here across from me wearing your full-on Red Army officer's uniform with all your medal and regalia. You look like you're about ready.
Most of it's stolen valor.
It's the only true valor that's worth anything is only stolen valor. It's been a while since you've been on the show.
Yeah, 10 episodes, I guess.
That's true. It's just a lifetime.
In podcast, yes, it is.
In podcast, it is absolutely a lifetime.
So, what are we talking about today?
Oh, damn, I thought we were going to bullshit more.
Oh, okay, we can bullshit more. Yeah, I didn't mean to get right to the nitty-gritty right away.
Oh, you're all business.
Sorry.
You should be. You should filled with remorse and regret. Well, before we jump into it, though, what have you been up to?
I don't know, it seems a little too intimate for me. So.
Oh, okay.
A little, yeah.
Let's go back to cold
personal details. Yeah, personal details. I don't want to get into. How about you?
Also not much. As I stare very suspiciously at you. That's right. We shouldn't bring our personal lives into this.
Yeah, I don't want to dox me.
No doxing.
Yeah.
But what's weird is you have all of your profile pics, your high school photos on Facebook under Comrade Commissar Don. So I don't want
to make it too easy for people, though.
That's true. Speaking of getting personal and you're jumping right into business, which I am in favor of.
Okay.
I think we're here to talk about a book by Enzo Traverso called Left-Wing Melancholia, Marxism, History, and Memory. That's the order of the day. That's why we're here.
I like it. It's good.
you were obviously the only choice to do this episode with. Number one, because you are kind of a saint in my mind and agreed to basically just do whatever episode I wanted to do if no one else wanted to do it.
That is a standing deal, yeah.
Yeah.
Any episode you want to do, I will be here for it. So.
Okay. Well, I give you honorary Red Library sainthood because of that. But this book is really special, I think, because this was the book that actually inspired me to want to do this in the first place. And I think you were the one who, whenever I was like, hey, here's this book, I think maybe we should do a podcast, or what would you think? And you were very approving and very supportive.
Well, I like what you've done so far, so...
Well, I mean, I like what you've done so far since instead of all of us doing it.
It's like 95% you, so.
Well, that's fine. And Don also has, Comrade Commissar Don needs to learn how to take some compliments, which we'll work on this episode.
I'm terrible at that.
It's really hard. It's like really fucking hard to take compliments well from people.
We can work on that. Maybe
That's
episode
true.
21.
Yeah, episode 21. We'll just, how do I accept compliments gracefully? From a Marxist perspective, from a Marxist third worldist perspective.
I like that. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we'll read some Mao, talk about accepting compliments. That sounds good.
Did he write on that?
He did, yeah. Well, I've been working through the selected writings of Mao, all 10 volumes, and I'm pretty sure volume 2, the latter half of volume 2, he has some really great writings on that exact topic.
Wow, would never have expected that.
Yeah. He also talks about liberals being paper tigers and slaughtering the landlords. And then there's this weird thing about how to accept compliments. It's very strange. Yeah, the lesser known writings of Mao.
But just as valuable.
Absolutely just as valuable. Let's stop fucking around here.
Yeah.
Let's get into the real business.
So you mentioned that this was a huge inspiration for doing the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's probably what we'll be talking about a lot through the episode, but is there a specific detail or something like that stuck out to you that, really kind of gave you the push?
I mean, the cover. I just think it has a cool cover, which I'm going to put a picture of in the show notes because I just think it's like a fucking great book cover. It's very aesthetically pleasing. It's got a picture of Lenin on it. It's got some nice theory-esque sounding words.
Okay, yeah.
Which I think Traverso considers this book within, I guess, the realm of critical theory, if we had to describe it in any particular way. It's actually part of a series, I think, called New Directions in Critical Theory that Columbia Press has been doing. Okay. So it's, one of a whole particular direction in the vein of critical theory. So, and I think it fits really well. But, I mean, I will say the cover was pretty cool. I can't lie. That definitely got my attention.
I like the pointing finger.
Yeah, it's almost like he's pointing towards the moon, trying to let you know that the point isn't the moon.
I feel like he's pointing right at me, right into my soul.
Well, that's true.
I mean,
and he finds nothing there.
Yeah. Just darkness.
Just darkness, just pure blackness. Well, I think for me, what really struck me about this book and why I was really excited to do it is because in many ways, this book is one of the most personal, very personally meaningful books I think I have read in recent memory on theory, leftist politics, leftist history. I haven't really described this on the show, but I think I wouldn't be doing justice to talking about this book and why I think it's important in any real way if I didn't also say that, part of what my work is I'm a counselor and a therapist. And for me, reading this book hits on things from that area of my life that are really crucial, I think, to how I think about politics. But typically, I don't find good connections or good examples of how those two things can be incredibly relevant for each other and how they have really massive implications for how we do our political work or engaging with things that you might engage in terms of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, stuff like that.
Okay. Is that the main thrust of the book, or was that a specific section in the book, or what?
I guess the way that Traverso sets this up, and in terms of what is the point of this book, and to get into what exactly is the meaning of the title Left-Wing Melancholia, he basically says right out of the gate in the introduction that the aim is to investigate the melancholic dimension of left-wing culture in the past century. So I would say that the main thrust of the book is to engage with this particular aspect of the experience of being politically aligned with the left or on the left, and the power that that has, the hold that it has over us, and the function of, let's say, things like mood, emotion, things like affect, and how those actually play into things like historical narratives, memory, political struggle over the course of going all the way back to the French Revolution, and how in some ways what we're trying to grapple with is the effects on the aspects of our experience that do relate to emotions, and how emotions and thought are integrated in a very particular way, and kind of what is the effect of being politically aligned with a position that historically has dealt with many defeats, brutal, violent defeats. And after 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and what that symbolized, how we're left with a place in history that no longer can justify itself in terms of some future utopian project that somehow makes all the sacrifices, all the brutal defeats worth it. And what are we left with? And how in the wake of that, what we typically find is we get sort of enamored with the object of the past that we've lost, namely that object being a really feasible and powerful narrative and possibility of the overthrow of capitalism, the reality, the potential of a real socialist, communist, revolutionary movement. So I think the melancholy that we're going to talk about today is what happens whenever the narrative that sustains that, the sort of structure of meaning and purpose that sustains that through all of those losses evaporates, and you're left to reckon with the history that we find ourselves with.
So before we jump into the content of it, who do you think are the most important thinkers or works that he's using here, that if someone was going to approach this book, that they would need to either know or would be helpful to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that Traverso is kind of basing the approach that he takes, especially in the latter half of the book, on the Marxist critical thinker, messianic figure, prophet of some sort, Walter Benjamin, who is associated with the Frankfurt School, the early German school of Marxists that were kind of responding to the Bolshevik Revolution, who also were very focused on things like culture, technological advancement in art and aesthetics, and how to reckon with what does Marxist theory mean for these particular areas. I don't know. I mean, you've read a shit ton of Frankfurt School stuff, and I know you're familiar with Benjamin, so I don't know. How would you describe Benjamin as a whole? He's I was going to say, I actually haven't read very much Benjamin. Yeah, I think to me, he's a difficult thinker to summarize. The works that I've read much more dealt with concepts like sacrifice. Oh, yeah.
Looking at the world through this interpretation of these, I guess, like primal human instincts or human interactions with the world, and attempting to interpret the world through these things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like Benjamin is definitely a person that when I read, though, I don't feel like I have a very good handle on his overall project, though.
I think it's hard to find an overall project. I will say I've been studying Benjamin a bit more lately, and I don't know, maybe it would be a good thing to delve into on a future episode. We will definitely talk about Benjamin, especially his ideas of Marxism as what Traverso would call a secular theodicy, and the relationship between what he might also describe as the messianic force in history, and history in general. I mean, some of Benjamin's most famous writings have to do with a very sort of strange, complicated understanding of the relationship between theology and religion and Marxist political struggle and revolutionary movements, and how to make sense of what these things mean whenever you put them in dialogue with each other. So I think we'll get into some of that. But maybe just for framing the book and the content in general, Traverso is basically wanting to look at this phenomenon of left-wing melancholia. And one of the ways that he describes exactly what he's going to do, how he's going to do that, is through this use of a phrase, an idea that Benjamin has, which is called thought images. I think for Traverso, the idea and what he draws on Benjamin for is this idea that thought images, which are these really dense examples of history and memory and potentially utopian sort of future ideals, all sort of bound up together in what he very explicitly, uses images for, to somehow communicate this idea that an image and a thought, and he sort of puts a dash between them.
So these are like literal image, like a literal picture or like artwork or something like that? Okay.
Yeah, so in the first, probably third of the book, it's mostly text, but as the book progresses, it becomes much more dense and sort of, you see a lot more examples of images, of different art, of different historical pictures. There's some really interesting comparisons between the picture of Che Guevara whenever he was killed in Bolivia, and the comparison between the picture of Che, that whenever he was being basically displayed by the Bolivian army, and he compares that to, I think it's an old picture by Durer, and a sort of a picture of Christ.
Yeah, from that low angle or something like
that.
Yeah.
And I think he actually describes the picture of Che as Che's Pietà, which is the name of, and I think it was a sculpture. It's a sculpture in Rome about essentially Jesus being taken down off the cross and being held by Mary.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that he's kind of comparing the way that there's these particular images that we find connected with revolutionary socialist and communist movements, and trying to understand what exactly do these things communicate to us, and what's the power that they have for mobilizing different forms of thinking, a kind of urge, a desire for some sort of utopian future. And the way that I think melancholy and hope and all these things are sort of bound up with the way we encounter images of these past historical moments.
Okay. So the images are not necessarily a way beyond the melancholia. They're, I guess, like a window into the melancholia or something like that?
Yeah, maybe. I guess my reading of Traverso at that point is that these are particular examples from the history itself. They were emerging out of the history.
Okay.
So, for example, the picture of Che emerged, in the late 60s at a time whenever there still really was this narrative, this grand historical vision, this possibility that socialism, that communism, it did exist in the world. And the idea that its eventual triumph over capitalism was still a possibility. There were all sorts of potentials that were still there, that were still feasible, that still existed before they had dissolved after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Okay. In talking about this book being very personal, I would say that you identified a lot with this idea of melancholia.
I don't know. I could probably have an ethical complaint filed against you for saying this, but I think we're going to deal with the melancholia of this topic the way that anyone should in a healthy way, which is we're going to drink while we do it. But yes, I do think there's definitely a strong identification I have with this. And I would say that identification comes from, in some ways, my own personal experience of learning about the political history, the rise and fall of movements, the rise and fall of nations and revolutionary moments. And I would say that it's also about the actual work and the political organizing that I've done, the groups that I've been involved with. And I think what strikes me as being so powerful and so relevant for this is that typically we don't engage with this particular aspect of political engagement, political organizing, political history, especially on the left. And I'm increasingly suspicious that we are all smuggling in a really, really destructive sort of Cartesian dualism into the way we think about politics. And I think that it keeps us deeply attached to certain things about the past, about this history that we've lost. And I think the way that we experience that is a type of melancholia. And I think that what's so important about this book for me is the fact that melancholia and sadness and grief and loss are things that are incredibly repressed and incredibly lacking in terms of ways to express and have that acknowledged and honored in just our general prevailing social conditions. And then whenever you look at that in terms of politics, I think that it functions in a way that allows it to almost be even more unconscious and more powerful and more influential, precisely because we never seem to be able to step back and acknowledge this particular component of our experience as political agents, as people who identify so strongly with these movements. And so if we don't acknowledge that, I think, and I guess we'll get into this, but it keeps us almost strangely, I almost want to use the word libidinally, and almost obsessed with a past that no longer exists. And I think that part of the reason why we're obsessed is because we can't acknowledge the melancholia, or we can't acknowledge the fact that we need to mourn that. And there's grief with that. And I think if we don't do that, the more we're going to be so deeply, libidinally, unconsciously attached to this past and can't reckon with its effects on us, that we will be sort of just staring into the abyss of the past forever.
So you'd see this in essentially the frequent use of Soviet imagery and things like that from the past, but very rarely any type of attempt to create a new sort of new symbolism or new images or something like that for the left.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in one of those, a recent blog piece I had written, I was really drawing a lot on a quote from Frederick Jameson, which basically said that whenever we have lost the past, we've lost our connection to it. And that's maybe something we can get into, is like, what does it mean to be connected to the past, to be grounded in it? Yeah. But for Jameson, as long as we are connected to the past and feel rooted in it and feel that there's some ability to understand its meaning, to derive a sense of purpose from it, as long as we can do that, we can imagine the future. And once we lose that connection, that ability to imagine the future evaporates with it. And what we're left with is nostalgia in its place. And Traverso definitely grapples with this idea as well. He doesn't do it through Jameson, but he does talk about the function of nostalgia. And he sort of counterposes left-wing melancholia to what he would call right-wing nostalgia. And maybe that's a distinction and sort of a difference we can get into as well, because I think it's a pretty important and fascinating one.
Yeah, actually, I would like to talk about that if you don't. I mean, do you want to get into that distinction right now, or?
Let's maybe set it up a little bit more, and then we'll kind of delve our way in there. Cool. But maybe just to kind of help us frame a little bit of just kind of what we're going to be talking about with this melancholic dimension of left-wing culture. For Traverso, this essentially is going to be looking at not just institutions or organizations like a particular communist party, a particular radical left-wing organization in the States or in Western Europe or wherever it might be, or like Southeast Asia, Indonesia. But we're going to be looking at social movements that primarily put the struggle for equality at the center for their existence. Okay. So that's really the core of what drives them, is that they're this revolutionary movement that sees struggle as primary precisely to bring about conditions of equality because they don't exist already.
Do you feel like this is a broader definition of the left that wouldn't usually be used?
I mean, it's a good question. I think sometimes on the left, there's this distinction between organizations and social movements. Let's say, for example, in a lot of like Maoist discourse, and I'm thinking about J. Mufawad Paul, who wrote a book, I think a couple of years ago, called Continuity and Rupture, Philosophy in the Maoist Terrain. He had basically said that the main weakness or a potential dead end that a lot of radical leftist groups get themselves into is to basically find whatever social movement is currently in vogue, is currently arising, and to attach yourself to it, to put your energy and your organizational efforts towards supporting that movement, trying to radicalize people within it, and to sort of become the vanguard of that movement in a way, or to radicalize its political commitments more fully. So Paul would see this, or Mufawad Paul, I guess, it's hyphenated, but he would see this as actually a main error of leftist groups today. And he calls it, I think, movementism. So I do think there is this kind of distinction about either we're part of a movement or we're part of an organization.
Okay.
So I don't think that's the only way people understand it, but I think it is a really common one, especially for groups that identify as being more Maoist or kind of are in that particular strain.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, the other things that Traverso is really wanting to get into as part of this definition of the left, which is going to be part of left-wing melancholia, is that we're also talking about not just movements, but also theories, experiences, ideas. He also includes things like passions, feelings, utopian visions. So that's also what he's interested to investigate. He sees that what it is to be on the left is encompassing all these different dimensions. And that's what I find really powerful, because I think typically the idea that passions and feelings are part of being on the left is something that is, and this is maybe what I mean by Cartesian dualism, that there is this rational scientific understanding of what economics and what politics are. And to be on the left means to, and I'm just going to bring this up, I think especially for people identifying as men on the left, that there's this bigger sort of way that gender is socializing these two distinct categories of, let's say, men and women in the standard binary, that the common stereotype is that the way that men are socialized is that they're much more analytical, they're much more logical, that we're not in touch with our feelings as much. And I have to tell you, I think that this is a pretty big underlying social factor in how we can't experience the importance of this aspect of mourning and melancholy in a lot of leftist organizing today. Again, not for everyone. I think this cuts across a broad array of identities, but I do think that especially for men who are on the left, if we already come in with a challenge about engaging with sort of our emotional aspects of our identity and our subjective experience on just like our day-to-day lives and like our relationships and like who our family members are, then to relate that to some large abstract political history is going to be even more fucking challenging. But I think it's just as relevant to me to relate things like passions and emotional responses to things like political history and organizational dynamics. I think it is just as important to relate those factors within that as it is as having like a strong economic analysis or a really clear-headed idea of like political history of imperialism and things like that. Okay. And maybe that's where it comes into like why this feels so personal to me doing the kind of like counseling and therapy work that I do, because that's what you're doing. Yeah. Like that's your realm is the way that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors and relationships all relate to each other.
I mean, if we're thinking of the left as, not just a series of ideas, but a series of, I guess, emotional maybe reactions to, certain experiences, is there a set of like passions and experiences that you would point to and say like, or passions and emotions that you would point to as being particularly like on the left, that might be unique to the left, that be different from someone on the right or a reactionary?
I think historically, anything that grapples with, let's say, the morality of being part of a political struggle that places equality at its center. I think historically we've seen these things as being remnants of a utopian socialism, remnants of a kind of enlightened liberal humanism that scientific analysis is designed to correct or to refute in terms of its actual capability of bringing about some sort of overthrow of capital, let's say. Now, I think what's really important about this is that the way that things like passions and emotions, just to use Traverso's words, I think those do cut across. I mean, if you want to use the left-right distinction, that's fine. If you want to use other distinctions, that's fine too. But I think what I would say is of absolute fundamental importance is to understand that this component of subjective experience of our humanity is disastrous to not include this in how you think about the way we relate to more abstract ideas of economics and political theory. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about, let's say, how someone who might be more on the right or conservative or whatever it might be, how they're driven by rage and resentment. And maybe that's true. It also strikes me that there can be all sorts of positions on the left that are driven by maybe similar, maybe different levels of emotion and affect and feeling that are just as vital for why you engage in the political actions and behaviors that you do, that are just as powerful and just as influential on us as anyone on the right. So the point is not to say that, well, there are certain things that people feel on the right that drives their political positions, and there are certain things that people feel on the left, but just to, start by acknowledging that this is a really crucial part of political life.
Yeah.
I
remember because when I was younger, I was definitely on a portion of the right, at least, that there might be a similar emotion to seeing something, like being angry at some sort of injustice. But where on the right, I think the response to that form of injustice was much more of just like, well, it's like how the way the world works or something like that. And then when I started to much more question that, I think is when I found myself on the left, that injustice there should be something done about it. And there maybe can be something, or, at least we can hope for that something can be done about that. And so I don't necessarily there is a very base emotion of a reaction to some form of injustice that I think is necessary. But then there also needs to be that which I don't think is necessarily a rational response of either this is the way the world works or something should be able to be done about this. It's almost in this weird, to me, gray area between an emotion and a belief or something like that. It's
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. And I think that's what Traverso is getting at or trying to explore is this gray area. It's the way that there are all sorts of gray areas and these huge sort of unknown spots of our experience about how we get from a feeling that there is injustice in the world and there's something that makes me feel angry or terrified or confused about that, to the level of saying, well, I think that this is just the way the world works, or yes, there is this injustice and free markets are the best way possible to alleviate that injustice, which really at the end of the day, I said this on the episode, I think on debt with Comrade David. That's a very legitimate, very genuine, I think, ideological way of responding to that. I don't agree with it, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that, that it isn't necessarily always some malicious, disingenuous sort of response to it. I think there are a lot of people who really do believe, for whatever reason, that free markets really are the best way to alleviate the injustices in society. I think the difference between that and being on the left is the very firm commitment that actually, no, they're not. They are the problem.
Yeah.
So what we need to do to actually fix this problem is to overthrow the base mechanisms of it being generated in the first place.
Yeah. I would say that that's what changed the way that I thought was not, I think that there are definitely a large number of people that just do not have any sort of sympathy or empathy for people who are suffering. But I think there's a decent number, and I was in that, who just thought, well, the capitalist system is the best way to try and alleviate that. And then there are those people who will fall through the gaps, quote unquote, but still this is the best system that we can try for. But when I became convinced that wasn't the case is when I changed, my political position. So I think that we should, in some sense take that seriously when we interact with people who might be on the right and trying to figure out which one it is. Is it that they just simply don't care about these people, or is it that they just are convinced that there's not another better system that can replace it?
I absolutely agree. And I think that is a major shift that has to take place, because the truth is that these components of someone's experience, the relationship between let's say the theoretical understanding that they have about why the world is the way that it is something that can be changed. And, one of the things that maybe it would be important to bring up here, too, that I read Traverso as drawing on and being influenced by, although I don't think he really discusses it, but it is sort of a major area of critical theory and philosophy that has kind of been posed out of it's almost posed as a critique of Marxism and like class-based analysis sometimes. That's probably a little unfair. But it's essentially the school of thought, what we call affect theory, which emerged out of the work of two French philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, who some people maybe have heard of. We'll post a couple of links if not. But essentially, they were drawing on Marx in important ways and developing a new realm of philosophy and theory and political engagement that I think now has led to a particular way of understanding the way that affect functions in politics and in just general social bodies as a whole. A few people who are considered in this camp would be Sarah Ahmed, Brian Masumi, and then a handful of others. But basically, it's this idea that this realm of affect, and sometimes emotion and affect are used interchangeably. It's a very blurry distinction depending on who you're reading. But that these aspects of politics are absolutely vital to understand why is it that people not only believe the things that they do about the world and about these deep sort of almost visceral reactions to what they find themselves seeing and witnessing as being part of whatever society they're in. But it's also about the way that certain things like media and political discourse actually engage and mobilize our affects in very particular ways. So it's not just like we feel these things and then we engage in politics because of that. It's also about this really blurry, kind of almost dialectical back and forth. And I'm doing my little like finger dialectic motion here for the little dialectic. But it's the way that these two things are dialectically kind of informing each other. And I actually think what Traverso is trying to do is to take some of those insights, which I think are absolutely valid. I mean, you and I have read Ahmed together. And to actually take those back into the realm of Marxism and to say, what does this show us about Marxism? But also, this isn't just about melancholy and emotion. It's also about memory. And so, you know, a really interesting thing is the way that Traverso talks about this rise of studies of memory and the importance of memory in politics sort of was coming around the mid to late 80s at around the exact time that the Soviet Union was dissolving. The great historical victory of socialism was crumbling before our eyes. We see this kind of weird development of memory as being a really important place of theoretical investigation and to understand what is the role of memory in terms of politics. And I think it's a really fascinating connection to make. And, you know, someone we both know, Paul Ricoeur, he talks about Paul Ricoeur a bit, and a handful of other thinkers. And so maybe we can kind of get into some of those components as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, just a couple of other things for Traverso that just to really put a fine point on what we're trying to talk about here. So in terms of memory, what Traverso is interested in is this memory of victories and defeats on the left, and how melancholy, what he sees as melancholy, he describes it as being a stage of the soul, which I find a really interesting way to describe that. But I also, here's what I think is really key. He describes it as a field of emotion. And this idea of a field coming from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu is this idea that, you know, it's hard to pinpoint one particular component. It's about how all of these things interrelate together to create a general dispersed kind of experience that we have. And maybe by getting into more content, we can figure out exactly what the fuck that means.
I might need some further clarification on that.
I thought it was totally clear. I just thought we'd just move on after I said melancholy is a field of emotion. So, well, just to drive home the connection to Walter Benjamin, just to come back to that, because Benjamin's a big part of this. To get back to how Traverso thinks about thought images, this is a quote from the introduction. He says, "In short, I will work with multiple sources, analyzing them as thought images, according to Benjamin's concept." And he basically says that the point is not to build a monument or write an epitaph about the history of the left, but essentially to explore a multiform and at times contradictory memory landscape. And I think that's, to me, the connection to Benjamin that he's saying. It's the idea that memory is structured, almost you can explore it like a landscape, like a literal geographical space that you can walk around and see and experience and touch and have this very visceral engagement with. And so for me, I think, just to kind of put a point on it. I mean, it's Benjamin, so it's a complicated concept. But I think that's what Traverso is getting at, is like, what would it be like to explore the history of the left through this particular approach and this particular way of understanding memory that Benjamin tried to develop.
Okay.
That's it.
Good.
That's all the convincing.
Okay, yeah. I'm in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I mean, considering we've been talking for a while already. So.
Since we're halfway through the episode.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, let's go back to post-'89 and the Cold War.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do, because I did read part of the introduction. I thought it was interesting that he like you'd mentioned earlier, that the left had suffered a number of defeats in the past, but 89 was very different in the sense that in the past there was some sort of pride that could go along with the sense of defeat, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was no longer that sense of this loss being able to be like rallied around or something like that, or to be to be championed. Yeah. So would you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. One of the things that Traverso distinguishes between, let's say, like this pre-'89 experience of being on the left and post-'89 is that the past was, pre-'89 was experienced, the idea that every defeat somehow was always justified because the victory was assured in the future. Exactly. So he talks about a number of things here. One being the final writings of Rosa Luxemburg before she was executed by the Freikorps and just thrown in the canal. That for her, every defeat of the left would essentially be kind of retroactively validated and retroactively seen as being a necessity and crucial to the eventual victory of socialism over capitalism in the future. So it's this way that every defeat, every loss, every sacrifice can always be contextualized and given a sense of meaning and purpose and value precisely by the ability to project into the future some utopian vision of what will come about eventually. And I think it's a really powerful idea. And I think it's one of those ideas that it changes the way we think about what victory and defeat meant politically. That they mean the kind of subjective experience of those is fundamentally different. If we still somehow can project ourselves into the future, the way that Jameson talked about, with the idea that somehow, some way, this sacrifice will be validated, that will be a martyr to that cause in some way. And every victory looking back into the past from the utopian future will be seen as a necessity in some way.
I mean, Traverso doesn't, as far as what I was reading, he definitely is not Stalinist by any means. It does not seem like he is a big fan of the Stalinist regime. So it is interesting that, and I would say that I feel like a lot of people on the left aren't, to some degree, or I would say to very large degrees, most of them are not. And so it is curious to look at something like the collapse of the Soviet Union as this almost irrecoverable loss, and to, I guess, to wonder why this one, like why was it, if a lot of the people on the left wouldn't have necessarily championed the Soviet Union anyway, is it more that capitalism seems triumphant than it was necessarily that, like, the last thing fighting against capitalist domination of the world is gone, and so even though one wasn't a fan of the Soviet Union by any means, that it's specifically the victory of one over the other that signals the end of hope or something like that. Yeah,
well, I think there are elements of this which function on the level of, let's say, utopian imagination, ideas, passions, the way that Traverso is described, but I think there's a very real, concrete, material, global balance of power as well. Yes, there were other communists and, governments identified as socialists or communists that outlived the USSR. But for almost 100 years, the USSR functioned as the sole balancing agent. And I'm actually thinking about the episode that we just did with Comrade Jason on this, that for decades upon decades, the U.S. was always checked in some degree to its ambitions, its imperialist sort of programs, precisely because there was some other state that we could qualify as a superpower that would balance it, that at least would somehow resist it, in various ways. And I think that the power that had in terms of the imagination, even if someone, let's say, was critical of the Soviet Union and thought it was a degraded worker state, thought it became a bureaucratic monster, and which was, I think, especially validated after Khrushchev's speech in 56, right? That we now all of a sudden knew that, at least the way it was understood, is the crimes of Stalin were so vile to fundamentally alter our perception of the history. That was another one of those events that sort of retroactively changed what we did understand of the past and our memory of it. So in some ways, I think it's really complicated because, and I had this question too, like how many people really at this point, and especially now its relevance for today, how many people actually feel a sense of melancholy over the loss of the USSR? I don't know. I don't know. It seems that Traverso, writing, as a historian through this period, he did understand that. He lived to see it. And so I think there is a very critical question here to ask about, is this really relevant for people who were alive and who grew up in this world where there was the USSR and its adversary, the US? But for someone who was born after 1989, do they think about this? Is it important to them? Do they experience melancholy in the same way? I don't know. That's maybe an open question. I will say I do think there are real elements of melancholy that persist, that somehow we interact with and engage with and somehow are mobilized in us because of the history, because of the different ideas and the way that we talk about this history now, which I think is very much conditioned by people who actually did live to see the fall and who do experience that melancholy.
Yeah, to me, there definitely does seem to be a sense of melancholia and hopelessness almost on the left. Yeah, sometimes I wonder if, would there still be that same sense even if something like the Soviet Union still existed? Obviously, it's only in name, but when you look, China is still, at least in name, a communist country, still a large and powerful communist country. Yeah, like I said, it has definitely changed to some form of capitalism.
You fucking revisionist.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll get lots of hate mail based on it for saying that. I don't know, but
find Don on Facebook. Comrade Commissar Don.
But just it doesn't seem like it existing has necessarily changed that melancholy or that lack of hopelessness, or that hopelessness, lack of hope. And so I'm curious is it due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, or is it maybe something else and is it possibly even the loss? I hate to say it like this, but is it maybe the loss of these older communist regimes that at least open up the possibilities of imagining something that's very different from them?
It's an interesting thing to ask. There was a way that the uprising in various places like Poland and other places prior to the collapse, I think, was seen as the vision of something different. The idea that it was possible to have socialism with a human face, to have these sort of reforms within socialism to challenge the bureaucratic structures. And so whenever the wall did fall and the Soviet Union collapsed, the thing is that whatever vision was there to have something different also collapsed in its wake. Those movements didn't develop into anything as a viable alternative out of, let's say old school bureaucratic Soviet state socialism or capitalism itself. As well as I do that what happened is essentially the thugs of neoliberalism showed up and then
gutting of these economies. Exactly.
Gutted the economies, privatized everything. And speaking of nostalgia and melancholia, now I just saw an article the other day that they're polling people in Russia, and the highest numbers that have been polled so far are actually nostalgic for the Soviet Union. And, we were talking about this the other day, but think about a film like Goodbye Lenin and the way that you kind of see in that film. I personally think that film is one of the best distillations of left-wing melancholia that you could actually see in visual representation.
Okay. Can we go into that further right now?
No, we cannot. No. Yeah. So Just to kind of recap the film for anyone that's not seen it, but I would highly recommend that everyone watch it because it's very instructive for this discussion.
There will be spoilers.
I mean, are they though? I mean, they'll retroactively not be spoilers. We'll be really dialectical about this. So in general, the idea is that young guy and his sister, they live in the GDR. So during the Cold War, Germany was split. Western half was capitalist, was, I guess, how would you describe the West Germany prior to the wall falling?
You mean besides capitalist?
Yeah. Well, I was almost wanting to say like very like Western European, like very sort of oriented towards NATO and the U.S.
I was going to say, yeah, quasi-client state. Of
Yeah,
the US.
yeah, that's a great way to describe it. And then the East Germany on the other side of the wall was socialist state, very much within the realm of the Warsaw Pact and basically across the Iron Curtain, let's say. So essentially the story goes, this young guy, he's very, I would describe him as being very disillusioned and sort of alienated within Soviet society.
I'm going to rely on you for the description of the movie. It's been like 10 years since I watched it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you just kind of gather that he's also very alienated. So he participates in some of the protests that they're wanting to bring the wall down. They're wanting to like westernize. They're wanting to open society. And essentially his mother, who he's very close to, who also, funny enough, was married, and her husband and their father had left and gone to, you hear, is West Germany somewhere. So he goes over the wall. He disappears. He's gone from their lives for, most of their life. I think he leaves them there in their early childhood. So the mother, essentially, as a response to the husband leaving, to the father leaving the family, becomes just completely filled with patriotic zeal and purpose, and basically dedicates her whole life to the GDR and to socialism. And then essentially her son participates in this protest, against the bureaucratic state, wants openness in society. And there's this really key traumatic moment where the mother, out of curiosity, is leaving a party and then like stumbles upon this protest and sees her son and has a heart attack and collapses right in front of him. She essentially is in a coma for, I think, a handful of years. It's definitely after the wall falls, after the Cold War has ended, the USSR dissolves. So she wakes up at a certain point, and her son basically is told by the doctor that anything that is distressing, is emotionally upsetting, could bring about another heart attack in your mom and she could die. So his response to this is to create the illusion that the USSR and the Cold War never ended.
Right.
And she's stuck in her home, and he spends all this effort, makes fake news broadcasts, finds old jars of products from the days of the GDR and fills them with pickles and jams and stuff to convince her that the Cold War never ended, that socialism is still existing and is still vibrant and still has all this meaning and purpose. Well, what's really fascinating about this film is at a certain point, he becomes more invested in the illusion for himself and for his own nostalgia for the past, his own melancholia, than for his own mother. And there's this really powerful moment where she actually leaves their apartment and learns that the Cold War has ended, socialism has failed, capitalism is ascendant. And there's this moment where he's trying to bring about the end of this illusion by basically convincing her that all the people from West Germany who are in their neighborhood, who are drinking Coca-Cola, buying commodities, engaged in consumerism, are essentially, they're just refugees from West Germany who hated capitalism so much they had to get out, so they emigrated to the GDR. But there's this really amazing sort of sublime moment where they're watching this fake news broadcast about why there are people from West Germany or West Berlin and East Berlin. And the mother knows that it's an illusion. His sister knows that it's an illusion, obviously. Everyone knows it's an illusion. And all of this is supposed to be sustained for his mother, but his mother now knows. So there's this great moment where he's watching the TV and is experiencing this pure joy about the fact that socialism never ended. And there's this great scene of just his mother and his sister just looking at him while he watches the TV, and they're just beaming with joy because they're getting to witness his own enjoyment over this fantasy that he has that the wall never fell. And to me, it just was, I watched it right after reading this book, and it just was the perfect example of that feeling of alienation and disconnection from what did exist, but then also this intense melancholy about the past and this deep investment that he didn't even realize he had until he developed this illusion for his mother.
I'll have to rewatch it now, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's going to be tough since I own it. It's going to be tough to rewatch it.
Yeah, that's true. And also, I just spoiled it for you. So.
That's true. Spoiled it twice. Once I watched it myself, and then I got it described for me. Here's a real question. Did you find it funny? When I got it, it was described to me as a hilarious movie, and I was expecting it to be very comedic. And I watched it, and I thought it was a good movie. I just didn't think it was that funny.
I would agree. I did not find it that funny.
Okay.
I would describe it.
Weird, yeah.
I would actually describe it as melancholic. To me, that's a much better description of the film. I think that whatever humor is there is almost what Traverso describes as a sense of the uncanny. Like, it's weird. It's weird more than anything else. It's this strangeness of feeling completely unmoored from a history that had grounded most of the 20th century. And all of a sudden that history dissolves what seems like overnight. And I think the sense of uncanny and weirdness, I use that word a lot these days, because to me, that's what I feel like is the best descriptor. It's this sort of strangeness, this strange unreality, by not being grounded within those same kind of coordinates. And just to kind of connect this whole idea of Goodbye Lenin to the book.
Yeah.
So one of the really fine points that Traverso puts on this is that whenever the wall fell and the Warsaw Pact dissolved, USSR dissolved, state socialism fell, he describes it as the entire representation of the 20th century fell with it. So it wasn't just a physical structure that fell. It was also this kind of ideological, sort of existential structure that fell with it. And he also describes it as a sense of the uncanny. And now another really important part of this is that whenever the wall fell and state socialism fell, or socialism in general fell, the idea of the dialectic of history also fell. I feel like we need to have like the alarms go off, the bells like bow, 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 bow. Dialectic has just been said. And
Timestamp it. What time is it right now?
4:40.
We should have like a timer for each episode.
That was an hour and 2 minutes
how
without
long it takes
dialectic.
us to go every episode without saying dialectic?
Well, to be fair, I did do the little dialectic hand
shit,
motion earlier,
okay,
so
okay,
I think that would be the timestamp.
That's true. I do want to start that timestamp every episode. When is dialectic said?
Okay, we'll start it here.
Let's go back to the other episodes too.
I'm not doing that shit. You can do that shit. I'm not doing that shit.
I'm going to do it.
I do think that what's important about this, and in terms of sort of maybe part of why there is this sense of melancholy, is that, the idea, and I think this goes back to Luxemburg and what we were talking about with this idea that somehow the future would always justify us and would make meaningful and make valid the sacrifices and the struggles. So whenever the dialectic is also shattered for Traverso, it's the idea that this sort of movement of history, that socialism was seen as being the sort of the spear tip for. Capitalism develops, and this sort of brute standard historical understanding of socialism. Capitalism develops, socialism develops as a critique of capitalism, and eventually socialism will overthrow or overcome capitalism through capitalism's failures because of its own internal contradictions. So whenever socialism falls, we're left with the question, well, what about capitalism now? The contradictions have not brought about the victory of socialism. And maybe this gets back to what you were saying. Maybe this is part of why there hasn't been the development of something new. Because for so long, what we've all been grounded in, and I think this does still exist today. I mean, I think we are in some sort of gray zone, some like liminal part of history where we don't really know what potential alternatives there could be outside of capitalism and socialism. And I say this as a Marxist. I mean, that's the other thing too. That's why this book is really personal for me, because in some ways, like, I grapple with these questions myself. I mean, is the answer that we turn back to struggle in the farms and, struggle in the countryside, the way that they did in China, or the way that they did in, they're doing in the Philippines now. What do we do? I think that that's part of what we've also lost, is that this idea that there is some larger historical justification for engaging politically in a radical way. I think we underestimate the deep implications of that on just our whole experience of politics, of ourselves, and of each other. And I think that part of what I see is so destructive in a lot of groups, thinking about how people still get called revisionist today, or someone basically, there's arguments over Kautsky today. And not that the history isn't important, but this is the difference, I think. History is no longer seen as this storehouse of victories and defeats that somehow generate the future for us because we're within it. It's no longer that. Traverso describes it, now history is a debt. It's a burden. It's this thing that we're saddled with, that we're constantly wondering who is identifying with certain currents of history versus others. And I think that that is something that is deeply rooted in a feeling of melancholy about the past. Just to drive this home, and something that Traverso talks about, is that there's a difference between melancholy and mourning. Now, we've been talking about melancholy a lot, and he relies on Freud for this, that Freud, in an old essay on melancholy, basically described the psychoanalytic function of melancholy as being whenever someone has been deeply, let's say, libidinally invested in an object. Now, this could be your mother, it could be your father, it could be phallus, I don't know. Use whatever Freudian framework you want to, but the idea is that we're deeply invested on a primary level with these objects in our life, that we seek for structuring our sense of the world, structuring our sense of ourselves and our sense of meaning and purpose. And whenever we lose that object through death, through absence of one kind or another, that mourning would be where we somehow integrate the loss of that object into our psyche and then can move on from it. But the pathological response is to experience melancholy over that object, which is we almost feel that that same investment in the object persists even after it's dead. And so it's almost as if we get stuck in this place of never being able to integrate that experience of loss and mourning because we're invested in this object as if it still exists. And it's this sort of pathological, Freud would call it a pathological response to the loss of an object. And I think what's really radical about Traverso's approach here is to really challenge us to think seriously about how much we may also be relating pathologically to not history, but to memory, to memory of the past and what used to exist, the utopias that we used to dream of and that are no longer possible for us. But we can't move on from that. We can't mourn that, really, which isn't a paralyzing kind of a response. Like great anger, great energy can be generated out of mourning. He talks about the AIDS crisis in the late 80s and how the mourning over the loss of friends and lovers and of a whole group of people and the way that that was brutally brought about by Reagan's government and the state, how their mourning became a way of politically engaging with that. And I think that he sees melancholy as not leading to those kinds of responses and possibilities, but to precisely keep us hyper-focused on the object that we've lost.
Sure.
Well, I don't know. Considering, we both, I didn't suck on a pacifier with a hammer and sickle when I was young. It took me a long time to get to where I'm at on the left. I'm curious, for you, I don't know. Do you find that based on what you've seen of like being on the left and our discussions about it, do you see some of that as well? Do you find that is a helpful or sort of interesting way to think about what we've both described as being these strange obsessions with the past and with particular political moments and figures?
Yeah, I've struggled for a while to try and understand, I guess, where this lack of imagination for the future that the left has right now is stemming from or is coming from, and also how to move beyond it. But like I said, just from the small parts that I perused, I think Traverso at least has some interesting ideas of how to talk about it. I don't know. Does he get to a point where he at least discusses some form of a way forward or a way to like wrestle with this melancholia?
Sadly, I wish I could say yes. Okay. I have to tell you, this book was heartbreaking for me, because the first 50, 60 pages I found to be one of the most powerful things I've read in recent memory for me. And I think the book's roughly like 220, 230 pages. And I found myself feeling as if the book just dissolves into meditations on particular figures in the past. Theodor Adorno, who is another big influence on this work, because we were talking about that earlier. But he does talk about Benjamin, he talks about Adorno, he talks about the French left thinker, writer, Daniel Ben Said, which is sort of the last part of the book, is a essay on Ben Said. And I remember getting to this point and wishing that whatever promise, speaking of, failed utopias, whatever promise was there at the beginning of the book just seemed to evaporate very quickly. And there are interesting things in the book. There are things worth reading it for in its totality. But no, I don't think that he offers any way forward, except to maybe just point to this as a potential factor of precisely why the future seems so impossible to invent.
Okay.
And just to get back to this, that's one of the things that Traverso describes, is that from the French Revolution onward, the idea was the future was always something to be invented. That was essentially how it came to be. That was the radical project, was to invent the future. After 1989, we no longer can invent the future. The future is something that we have to excavate out of the past. And I think this is what I see a lot of today in the groups that organize, and the discussions about the DSA, about these other large political movements in the US and abroad, is it feels like we're grabbed our shovels and our pickaxes and we're excavating as fast as we fucking can, because the world is going to be on fucking fire in 12 years. And it feels as if we're going in the wrong direction. That's my feeling.
Yeah, I thought that the narrative that he presents of, he has that Cicero quote, which is basically like, history is the best teacher, history is life's teacher, I think is what it was. That essentially gets overturned during the French Revolution, that it's no longer history that is a teacher, it's like we look forward. And then in 1989, gets reversed again, and now it's all we can look to is history. We don't look to forward to the future at all. Yeah, I don't know, that resonated with me like pretty strongly.
I think so too. Well, maybe another thing that I thought was really interesting about this is to think about, in the point that we're at now, that whenever the future is no longer being invented, we're also not just abandoning the future. In some ways, we're abandoning whatever history and memory we do have of what socialism was. So he has this, I think, really provocative idea that because so many of us are, not everyone, but a lot of people, I think, are very, very inclined or are very, very quick to denounce any kind of historical nuance about things like the Soviet Union, Stalin's reign, like what actually happened, challenging sort of typical Cold War narratives we have about these things, about the Cultural Revolution, about Mao. Essentially, we have abandoned that history to a liberal right-wing interpretation of it. So not only have we lost the ability to imagine a utopian future, we've also lost our own history. We've lost control over the history that we do have, even if it's one that we're like melancholy attached to in a way. I mean, just as sort of a quick example of this, one of the things that I think has been really interesting lately is that a thinker, a theorist, Kristen Godsey, has written a lot about the relationship of sexual activity and sexual relationship between men and women in the GDR during the Cold War, and actually has these really interesting studies about all these radical utopian potentials. The fact that all the survey data, all the studies they did of this showed that actual sexual activity in East Germany was much more fulfilling and occurred much more often than it did in the West. So that's a piece of this history that also gets completely abandoned because of this weird I guess the word would be kind of the synecdoche between a whole vast array of incredibly complicated, incredibly unique developments of socialism in all of these specific national and cultural contexts. So, whenever we think about socialism, it's immediately, well, now we're talking about Stalin and Mao, and we're not talking about the factors of sexual and gender liberation that were occurring in places like the GDR, and the actual research and scientific evidence that shows that sexual relationships were much more fulfilling in that time, that women were much less able to be trapped in these violent, abusive relationships precisely because their material security was a guarantee that they didn't have to rely on an abusive partner to fulfill for them. So, these are all these like. I mean,
isn't it still that, like in Eastern Europe, the amount of women who are in like a lot of the sciences and engineering fields is like significantly higher.
Yeah, that's right.
And like Western Europe and the U.S. is still trying to figure out ways of like balancing it. But yeah, in Eastern Europe, it's significantly higher from the from socialism. So.
Yeah, and that's a legacy of this that is lost, I think. And so it isn't to say that, of course, that horrible things didn't happen. Yes, executions did happen under Stalin. There were famines at different points in, the early Soviet Union, in China, and all of these different places. I think that the key is that we very quickly, we're all sort of inheriting this particular liberal right-wing interpretation of this history, and it means that our very first step is we have to somehow defend this history against these interpretations. And without being able to step back and have at least some way of having the starting point of the conversation be, listen, yes, some of this stuff did happen. I'm firmly of the opinion at this point that even the things that we think did happen in terms of like executions under Stalin, I mean, the best research I've seen on this shows that the death tolls were dramatically lower than most anything you're ever going to encounter in any kind of like Western media. I think it was Forbes or The Economist who just posted some article earlier this year that's like, oh, guess what? Turns out Stalin really didn't do all this stuff. Whoops. So, I mean, I think that there are points to challenge here, but at the very least, it's to at least say that, listen, even if we want to talk about atrocities, horrible violence that did happen, we also have to understand the real radical liberatory things that also happened and that were there and did exist, and trying to make sense of that. But I just find it's incredibly hard to have any discussion about that, because what we're always contending with is the fact that we have all, maybe not all of us, but whether we like it or not, this history has been sort of dominated and abandoned by this right-wing liberal interpretation. And I think this really became dominant. At least there was no major countervailing force after 1989.
Yeah. I mean, that seemed to be in one of the sections that I read, him pulling out this idea that the histories now are remembered very like one-dimensional, right? That looking back on the far left groups, whether it's in Germany or in Italy or something like that, and it's very much looked at, in any of the political violence that was done, but that's like the only dimension that's examined and stuff. And so as you don't look at like Red Army faction or something like that as targeting like pretty specific people who are basically like former Nazis and stuff like that.
Yet another piece of that history that's been lost, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even most mainstream histories, or even slightly left-leaning histories about something like the Red Army faction, which we're doing an episode on the RAF some point. That's got to happen. But yeah, the fact that this was also a response to the way that, as well as I do, that the Nazi regime was so quickly and seemingly effectively and efficiently transformed into a liberal democratic state. And the fact that a lot of those former Nazi officers, those Nazi linchpins in those systems, just essentially moved right into this like liberal parliamentary government, and that the RAF knew who those people were, and they were targeted. I guess, a phrase that Traverso has that really puts a fine point on this, which I think is what we're talking about, is that revolution, these real revolutions that were happened in this dominant liberal right-wing narrative of this history, they're subsumed under the word totalitarianism. And to me, that was a really powerful way to describe this, that whatever revolutionary potentials, whatever did exist, now we can't think of it outside of this one-dimensional idea that, well, these were totalitarian governments, and so all of that just recedes into the background. That's it for part 1 of our episode on Enzo Traverso's left-wing Melancholia, Marxism, History, and Memory. Big shout out to Comrade Commissar Don for coming on the show, for volunteering his time, his eardrums, his mental and emotional energy to work on this book with me and to really be part of quite a marathon episode and recording session that we did to get this one out to you this week. Also, big thanks to Don for helping us to edit some of the episodes, for being my comrade in crime, let's say, and helping make Red Library Political Education Podcast for Today's Left a reality, and getting that sweet, sweet content out there every Sunday night for y'all to hear and to absorb and be radicalized by. You know, one of the things I'm really excited about with putting out this episode and the one coming to y'all next week for part 2 is it feels like we're really building every single week on the concepts, on the history, on the theory that we're exploring and bringing to y'all. And hopefully that is coming through loud and clear. The way that this is a process that takes time, it takes patience, it takes a commitment to challenging yourself, challenging your own understandings of things, and it's another example of what we're hopefully modeling for ourselves, our own process that we are engaging in off of the airwaves. You know, a lot of what we do whenever we have these discussions in the form of these episodes that y'all check out is really kind of what we do just day to day. It's what we're always working on. We're always reading. We're always thinking and analyzing and reflecting on how exactly are we answering these major questions of economic transformation, political change, revolutionary potentials in ourselves and others, in our communities and our families and the people that we love, and even those that we might need to talk to, engage with along the way to try to take our own message seriously. And I hope that if y'all get nothing else from this show, you're inspired to actually go do that, to talk to others, to engage in this thinking and questioning of these ideas for yourself. Because that's what makes a strong and vibrant left. That's what makes a strong and powerful political force that is made up of agents, historical agents, as Paulo Freire once said. That's what we're aiming to do, to get out of this experience of melancholia, of alienation, and to reclaim that sense of meaningfully acting and making history every moment of every day. And that's a tall order, but I think we're up for it. All right, remember, like the show on Facebook, subscribe on iTunes, head over to Patreon if you want to support us a little bit. And until next Sunday for part 2, y'all take care of yourselves, keep fighting, and we'll see you next time. Peace.